Good afternoon. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. In a non-binding resolution, the European Parliament recommended on Wednesday that the European Union formally suspend the current accession negotiations with Turkey.
The European Parliament urged the EU to suspend membership negotiations with Turkey as a result of democratic backsliding in the country. The European Union Assembly made the appeal in a non-binding resolution approved on Wednesday in Strasbourg, France. The call is directed at EU governments and the European Commission, the bloc's executive arm, which together run the accession process with the Turkish government. Turkey's foreign ministry dismissed the call as meaningless. The resolution upholds a suggestion by the EU Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee saying the bloc should formally suspend the entry negotiations with Turkey. The 751-seat assembly rejected floor amendments by right-of-center members who has sought to toughen the recommendation by urging the EU to terminate or formally end the process. Turkey's EU membership negotiations, which began in 2005, have long been stalled. The government slammed the European Parliament's appeal ahead of March 31st local elections as disrespectful at a time when it said Turkey was working to put Turkey-EU relations back on track and restart the reform process to join the bloc, according to a foreign ministry statement on Wednesday. The membership to the EU is a strategic objective for Turkey, the foreign ministry said in the statement, urging the European Parliament to support visa liberalization for Turkish citizens in return for Turkey's efforts to stem a flow of refugees to Europe and update the customs union to increase its economic integration in the bloc.
Joining us today to talk about the European Parliament's recent Turkey decision is Demir Murat Seyrek, who is a senior advisor at the European Foundation for Democracy. Good afternoon, Mr. Seyrek. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Hello, good afternoon from Brussels.
So as we've just heard, the European Parliament has voted in favor of formally suspending EU accession talks with Turkey, and in doing so, it cited severe political and democratic backsliding under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Yet this is a legally non-binding decision. So my first question to you is, how seriously do you think this decision should be taken?
I think there are two sides of this issue, and we need to understand both sides very well. On the one hand, yes, it's true that it's a non-binding decision, and also in terms of its timing, it's a very unfortunate one because it's just almost 2 weeks before municipal elections in Turkey. So this decision can be easily used by Turkish government in line with their nationalist narrative. And it's also true that I think European Parliament fails to understand dynamics in Turkey because probably they consider this decision as a punishment to Turkish government for what's going on in Turkey in terms of human rights and democracy. On the other hand, I think this is very disappointing, not for government, but for millions of Democrats in Turkey who believe in Turkey's EU process and the importance of this process for the democratization of Turkey. We need to see that the process is still very important hope for future to bring back the democratization in Turkey. This is one side of the story, and usually this is the one side clearly seen in Turkey. But then there is another side, and this part is very important. And we cannot easily claim that European Parliament is not an important organization, EU institution. And not only the Turkish government, but actually many experts and even civil society organizations claim this in Turkey, but it's not true. Accession negotiations are de facto frozen anyway. But for Turkey-EU relations, there are two pressing issues at the moment in the upcoming future. So one is the issue of visa liberalization, and second issue is the modernization of the customs union agreement. And both are very important for Turkey, millions in Turkey. And for both issues, actually, the formal approval of the European Parliament will be necessary. So especially for the customs union agreement, the modernization of the customs union agreement, it is a very important issue considering the current economic situation in Turkey. This agreement, this modernization, or even starting the negotiations for this agreement could clearly send a very, very clear and positive signal to investors in the world that Turkey-EU relations continue and in terms of economic relations, there is a bright future for Turkey and the EU. That's why we need to understand this very clearly. Maybe European Parliament's this decision is not binding, but European Parliament is still a very important institution for Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Seyrek, you've already started talking about how this decision may have an impact on the already strained relations between Turkey and the European Union, but surely it will have some sort of a concrete effect. So how would you evaluate the kind of impact that this decision will have on Turkey-EU relations? Or let me put it this way, is Turkey's EU chapter over, in your opinion?
No, we cannot claim that Turkey's EU chapter is over. Certainly the decision is important, as explained. On the other hand, it is not putting an end to the Turkey's EU path. The Council of the European Union is the only body actually who can decide formally to suspend these negotiations. And luckily, there are many EU leaders who still believe that keeping this door open for Turkey is more important and potentially positive for future than closing the door. So they don't want to push Turkey away, and they don't want to cut this link totally, and to have still some say on Turkey and developments in Turkey. So this is very important. This is also a very big hope, I think, for millions in Turkey, because this is the only way probably in the future to bring Turkey back to normalization in terms of democratic reforms. So keeping the EU anchored there is very important. It was very difficult actually to open the accession negotiations 14 years ago. And probably under current circumstances in Europe and Turkey, it would have been impossible. That's also why it is very important to keep the door open, because once the door is closed, I think it will be almost impossible to reactivate the negotiations. So that's also very important. Having said that, I think we shouldn't also take this approach to the Council granted either, because following the elections of the European Parliament in May, certain dynamics can change in Europe, and the Council may take a different decision in the coming future in terms of Turkey relations, especially if they don't see normalization in terms of democratic rights, human rights, fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech. So unless certain things change in Turkey, it's unavoidable that the Council may come to a point to suspend these negotiations. I think we need to note at least one thing. It is, I think, important because Brussels is hosting today the EU-Turkey Association Council meeting. It's the 54th meeting of the Council, and this meeting is happening after 4 years, first time. So it is important because it shows that at least formally the relations between Turkey and EU continue, and it's also important that this meeting is just following the European Parliament's recent decision.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Mr. Seyrek, let's conclude by taking a look at how the Turkish government reacted to this decision. The ruling Justice and Development Party AKP spokesperson Ömer has called the decision disrespectful and worthless, and further added that it shows the European Parliament's far-right ideological tendency. What do you think about this response?
Well, it is true that the extreme movements, political movements in Europe are on the rise. And probably there are also some influence on this to political groups in the European Parliament too. However, I think it's very difficult to link this decision with the rising far right in Europe, frankly. And it would be a major mistake to link this two. And we cannot really understand the dynamics behind this decision in Europe if you look the issue at this way. The correct question should be, while recognizing the fact that the EU has done its own mistakes and probably EU has a responsibility for the current situation in Turkey by pushing Turkey away following 2005. On the other hand, the correct question should also be, what happened in Turkey in the last 14, 15 years since the start of the accession negotiations, whether Turkey is still at the same place, whether Turkey is still committed to these values and the accession negotiations, and what happened in Turkey in terms of democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, and freedoms. So unless we question this and we come up with a clear answer, I think we cannot really understand what has changed in Europe and European Parliament's view on Turkey. Because when the accession negotiations started, before the accession negotiations started, again, the approval of the European Parliament was necessary. And the members of the European Parliament actually overwhelmingly supported this decision. So, and even though far right, far left movements are on the right, in terms of the composition in the European Parliament, we cannot say that there's a major change. So what happened that those people who were supporting Turkey's accession negotiations 14, 15 years ago, and now they would like to suspend these negotiations. So what is the reason behind this change? What is the reason behind the understanding that Turkey is not on the right path in terms of democracy and Europe? It's also understandable, and I think we would all agree that Turkey is far from Europe now compared to 2005 in terms of those values, in terms of democracy, in terms of those rights. And there's a clear understanding in the Turkish government and that they were supporting these values. They were trying to implement the EU path. There was a clear reform process at that time. And we cannot really see this happening at the moment. That's why, unless we ask these questions to ourselves in Turkey, we cannot really come up with the correct analysis of what happened in Europe and what happened to those members of the European Parliament that they have changed their minds. Because the same people we were probably identifying as friends of Turkey at that moment, now some of those people are also identified as enemies of Turkey. So the question is, have they really changed, or is Turkey really clearly changing?
Thank you very much, Mr. Seyrek, for your comments and for being with us today.
Thank you.
Today we were joined by Demir Murat Seyrek, who commented on the European Parliament vote on formally suspending accession talks with Turkey. And now we'll continue with our next news video.
Turkish prosecutors have prepared an indictment against the main opposition Republican People's Party CHP's mayoral candidate for the capital Ankara, Mansur Yavaş, on charges of misconduct, which he denies and says are attempts to push him out of the March 31st local elections. There is a denial of execution ruling concerning a fake bill that Necmettin Keskin gave me, but no ruling of Court of Appeals against me. I am the real victim here, Yavaş said at a press conference on Tuesday in Ankara. Yavaş added, saying that Keskin was charged previously over involvement in inconsistencies and discrepancies in checks and similar documents, as well as child abuse claims. No conspiracy can withhold us, as the people of Ankara are backing us. We will file a complaint against AKP spokesperson Ömer Çelik, AKP's Ankara mayoral candidate Mehmet Özaseki, and the media outlet that covered the story of the alleged accusations, he added. The indictment follows a complaint by businessman Keskin, who has an ongoing dispute with Yavaş over the collection of a $600,000 check. Yavaş believes the AKP is trying to damage his reputation because of his popularity in opinion polls, which show that he is significantly ahead of his AKP rival Özaseki. Those who understood that they cannot win in a democratic election are trying to tarnish my reputation. This is the most disgraceful election campaign our political history has ever witnessed, said Yavaş. Keskin took the payment of the company I was a lawyer for and fled. As I took him to the court concerning a check he gave me, it was understood that the signature on the check was forged. It is not acceptable to show the victim here as the offender, he added. Are you thinking about acquitting this imposter who is facing trial on charges of child abuse? Things that are being done in panic because they know they will lose the elections, Yavaş said. Are you insisting on endorsing a candidate accused of such allegations? There are ongoing legal processes. "We are facing a situation that will make its mark on political history," said AKP spokesperson Ömer at a press conference he held on Monday. An Ankara court accepted the indictment prepared by Keskin's lawyers, seeking almost 4 months of imprisonment for the candidate on charges of wrongful conduct and disturbing individuals' peace and harmony.
The Turkish Statistical Institute, Turkstat, announced on Monday that the Turkish economy grew by 2.6% in 2018.
Turkstat noted that gross domestic product at current prices totaled about $784 billion last year. The GDP per capita in 2018 was $9.632 at current prices, the institute said, compared with $10.597 in 2017. Official figures reveal that the share of household consumption expenditures in GDP were 57.6% last year. In the last quarter of 2018, the country's economy shrank 3% year-on-year, while the GDP growth rate was 1.8% in the July-September period. Turkey aims to reach an economic growth rate of 2.3% this year, 3.5% in 2020, and 5% in 2021 under its new economic program announced last September. Moreover, industrial production in Turkey climbed by 1% in January on a monthly basis, Turkstat announced yesterday. Among the three main sub-indices, the mining and quarrying index enjoyed the highest increase with 1.7% in the same period. The manufacturing index rose 1.1%, while the electricity, gas, steam and air conditioning supply index slightly went up by 0.1% this January compared to December 2018. On a yearly basis, calendar-adjusted industrial production in Turkey dropped 7.3% year-on-year in January. Meanwhile, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has signed a decree abolishing the import duty on potatoes until April 20th. The duty will not be applied when importing potatoes in the volume of not less than 200,000 tons. In February 2019, potato prices in Turkey increased by 6.7%. President Erdogan has repeatedly stated that measures to combat entrepreneurs who artificially create shortage of potatoes in the markets will be strengthened.
U.S. State Department released its 2018 Human Rights Country Report on Wednesday. Turkey was given a special place in the report with a 63-page section highlighting forced disappearances and cases of arbitrary arrest.
Arbitrary killings, suspicious deaths of people in custody, forced disappearances, torture, arbitrary arrest, and detention were among a long list of issues recorded in the report. There were credible allegations that the government contributed to civilian deaths in connection with its fight against the terrorist PKK organization in the southeast, although at a markedly reduced level compared with previous years. The 63-page report said 14 civilians were killed by Turkish security officers in the first 11 months of 2018. The report cited Human Rights Association figures as saying, including 7 killed due to armored vehicle crashes and injured in arbitrary killings throughout the country during the same periods, including at government checkpoints and in government PKK violence. The report also said several human rights organizations had reported suspicious deaths of detainees in official custody, though figures varied. The Ankara-based Human Rights Foundation of Turkey reported 11 suspicious deaths of people in custody. According to the report, a long list of human rights issues were exacerbated by the 2-year state of emergency implemented shortly after the failed coup attempt in July 2016. The state of emergency ended last July, but the report notes that new laws and decrees codified some provisions from the state of emergency. Subsequent anti-terror legislation continued its restrictions on fundamental freedoms and compromised judicial independence and rule of law.
Turkish Airlines has announced that it will move all of its operations to Istanbul's new airport next month.
Turkish Airlines announced what is dubbed the Great Move in a tweet. According to the announcement, all Atatürk Airport operations, including flights, will cease at 2 a.m. on Saturday, April 6th. Flights will resume at the new airport from 2 p.m. onwards. Istanbul Airport was inaugurated by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on October 29th last year. Turkish Airlines has since delayed its move twice. Since the soft opening, some domestic flights have been tested. With its €25 billion price tag, the Istanbul airport is one of the world's most expensive. It stretches around 77 million square meters, has 6 runways, can hold 500 planes, and has parking space available for more than 70,000 cars. Once fully operational, the Istanbul airport will boast 200 million travelers annually. The government has guaranteed Istanbul Grand Airport, the consortium responsible for building and running the airport, 90 million travelers annually. More than 30,000 workers were employed in the building of the airport. However, construction has been marred with reports of worker deaths. The official death toll stands at 27, while NGOs and unions claim that the actual number is in the hundreds. In September 2018, a strike and protest hit the construction site, and dozens of workers were arrested. Meanwhile, environmentalists claim that the airport has devastated the northern forests of Istanbul and destroyed the habitats of numerous animal species. Another project that the government was keen to put in motion prior to the March 31st elections is the Gebze-Halkalı suburban train line. The line opened on March 12th and runs through Istanbul from west to east. Once connected to the Marmaray, the train line will carry 1.2 million commuters daily. However, unions claim that the line's opening was premature and that serious issues related to signalization remain unsolved.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 5 p.m. Goodbye.